Week 12 waiver wire ads. We're talking about week 12. We're almost at the fantasy football playoffs. This is like crunch time. And this is the time that you need to make the best possible changes to your fantasy football rosters. And some of the changes we're going to talk about today are long-term changes. Maybe you add that backup running back and the starter in front of them goes down and you get multiple weeks of usage. Maybe you add a wide receiver that is a little bit under the radar, but a wide receiver in front of him is banged up, and that player ends up helping you in like week 13, week 14, and maybe beyond. But this is like one of the most difficult weeks for the waiver wire, and really one of the most difficult periods that we have for fantasy football managers, because week 11 is here. This is like the buy-mageddon, buy-apocalypse, pain in the butt bye week, like the worst possible week for you, because you need a win. If you're still watching this in week 12, this means that you're competing for a fantasy football playoffs. Nobody who's like 12th place in their league wants to watch me talk about waivers for you know, their morning or whatever. So it's like, for me, we're talking about making the best possible changes, making calculated changes, and being able to navigate the bye weeks. And the bye weeks right now are horrible. Week 12 bye week teams: Atlanta, Buffalo, Cincinnati, Jacksonville, New Orleans, and the New York Jets. So New Orleans doesn't have much besides Alvin Kamara. Jacksonville obviously is sort of a train wreck right now. But when you're talking about Atlanta, you're talking about Bijan Robinson. You're talking about Drake London. You're talking about Darnell Mooney. Talking about Buffalo, you're talking about James Cook. You're talking about Josh Allen. When you're talking about the Jets, you're talking about Breece Hall. These are players that are making huge fantasy impacts. And that's not even mentioning what's going on with Jamar Chase, Chase Brown, T. Higgins, Joe Burrow, and the fantasy machine in Cincinnati. So we're sort of in a mess right now. So this is the show where we're going to try to find you those deep ads, those players who are not heavily rostered that can maybe help your team. And I got to say, it's not a perfect waiver wire week. This is not a week where you're going to find a ton of help, and there's a lot of fantasy managers who need a lot of help. So we don't have a great combination here. And then we've also got to keep in mind, week 13 is Thanksgiving week. It's going to be great. There's no teams on bye. We, of course, get the 3 games on Thanksgiving Day, and then we get the Black Friday game. But we don't have any teams on bye. So it's like a perfect week for us in week 13. Then you get into the nightmare situation. And week 14 is an absolute nightmare once again. Baltimore, Denver, Houston, Indianapolis, the New England Patriots, and the Washington Commanders all are on bye weeks. So we've got to keep an eye on that week 14. It's hard to be 2 weeks away, but we want to keep that one in mind, especially if you play FFPC and those playoffs start in week 14. So keep an eye on those ones. But again, this week's bye week teams: Atlanta, Buffalo, Cincinnati, Jacksonville, New Orleans, and the New York Jets. We want to make adjustments here. And anybody who's watched this show or listened to this podcast, you can find the podcast anywhere. Waiver Wired is what it's called. And of course, a lot of you watch right here on Player Profiler YouTube. This is a podcast where we specifically look at players available to you in 70% of leagues or more. So check your waiver wire. There's some leagues where guys that are going to be widely available in some like shallow leagues I don't even talk about. So just because I don't mention them, it's probably because they are rostered in too many leagues. We're usually talking about players for deep leagues, a lot of competitive leagues. But we will talk about a couple players who are going to be available to you a little bit more widely. So these players are rostered in 30 to 40% of leagues, meaning that these players are available to you in like 60% of leagues or more. One player to keep an eye on is Trevor Lawrence. He could return soon. Jacksonville's really a mess right now, but Lawrence in his last 2 games before he got banged up had back-to-back 20-point performances. So he was fantasy viable, especially for super flex managers. And if you're streaming quarterbacks, Trevor Lawrence in week 16 against the Las Vegas Raiders, even with Jacksonville in a tailspin, is a viable play. Zach Ertz, available to you in 67% of leagues. He's a low-end tight end 1 moving forward. Like, Zach Ertz is continually putting up good numbers. He caught 6 passes for 47 yards and a touchdown in his revenge game against Philadelphia. So keep Ertz in mind. if someone in your league, for whatever reason, didn't pick him up or he's just sitting out there. Braelon Allen, also available in 67% of leagues. This is just a contingent upside play, a handcuff running back for you to roster. But Braelon Allen does have viability if Breece Hall went down, and big-time viability. I think Braelon Allen would be a top 15 play at the running back position every single week Breece Hall would miss. So if you're looking for a lottery ticket, keep Braelon Allen in mind. Rashad Bateman, available in 68% of leagues. He's just a bye-week fill-in. That's all he is. But Bateman could potentially help you if you're in a complete jam. And one thing to remember just in terms of strategy is the overall scoring in your league, like the amount of points you need to win, the average goes down slightly when there's 6 teams on bye. So some of these guys who seem like not usually you wouldn't consider starting them, they have a little bit more viability this week with fewer options available to you because of all the teams on bye. We're going to take a quick break, and we come back. We're talking about quarterbacks, running backs, and wide receivers, and of course, tight ends. Got a fun tight end to talk about this week. After we take a short break, we'll be right back at Waiver Wired.
Hey, I know it's a popular statistic to cite, these underdog pick'ems, the vast majority of people go more than on any given player. Yeah, close to 80% of people, but that's because it's easier to find the shootouts than it is to find the dud games every Sunday afternoon. Like we knew week 5, Ravens-Bengals was going to be a shootout. And there goes Lamar Jackson for 4 touchdowns. There goes Joe Burrow for 5 touchdowns. Derrick Henry gets there. Zay Flowers is over 100 yards. Jamar Chase and T. Higgins both got there, as well as Chase Brown. Both Chases got there. You go more than. You 100x your payout on Underdog with their Pick 6 contest. But then you look at Dolphins Patriots, that's going down the toilet, right? Too bad Ramondre Stevenson at 18 fantasy points. But you improve your chances at positive returns when you correlate with these Underdog pick'ems. Use promo code Underworld. This is the biggest bonus Underdog has ever given out, up to $125. Promo code is Underworld. Put in $250, you get $125. Now go start picking.
Welcome back to Waiver Wired. I'm Theo Gremminger. We're going to talk about our top 10 overall additions at the end of this show. So if you're listening to it on the podcast and you want to just fast forward, go ahead. But we're going to cover a lot of names, especially for you in deep leagues. And we're going to cover a lot of names that can make your bench stronger heading into the fantasy football playoffs. And that's sort of a lot of what this week is. There's going to be some players that I'm going to mention that you can put right into your lineup, but a lot of these players are going to be depth pieces. That's sort of just the way it is this week in terms of the available players. We haven't really had a massive season in terms of waiver wire players hitting. There's been some big hits, but there hasn't been like an overwhelming wave of them. So when we talk about these contingent upside running backs, these backup running backs, maybe we see that over the second half of the season, the tail end of the season, because we sure didn't see at the beginning of the year. A lot of these older running backs are just dominating fantasy scoring right now, but sometimes players break down as the season moves along, so keep that one in mind. Quarterback position. You know I'm going to talk about Drake Maye. People like making fun of me in the chat for constantly hyping Drake Maye, but Drake Maye is that guy. I think he's really, really good. He played well on Sunday again against the LA Rams. He finished with multiple touchdowns for the 4th time this season, and he had 309 combined yards. That was the most that he has had all season long. So when we talk about Drake Maye, this is a player where if you are streaming quarterbacks, I love having Drake Maye as an option on my bench because I do think he presents to me an upside play at the position. It's not going to be immense every week. He's handcuffed by the quality of his offense, but this is a player that's doing well despite being in a tough situation. And we know that the rushing upside is there with Drake Maye every single week. And again, this is a player who in a limited sample size has had a 300 passing yard game and he's had a 95 rushing yard game. So we know that on both sides, passing and running, he can give us a spike week. And I want that as an option when I'm in a jam at the quarterback position. I will be using Drake Maye on a team or two this week that has quarterbacks on buys. Jameis Winston. Jameis Winston is available to you in 88% of leagues. And this is we're starting to see like good Jameis come through. And it's based on passing volume. Jameis Winston is really, really taking shots to his wide receivers. All 3 of his wide receivers are getting enough volume to be fantasy viable. We saw Jerry Jeudy have a very big game. Cedric Tillman's been a very strong waiver wire addition, and Elijah Moore we're going to talk about a little bit later. Jameis Winston had 395 passing yards this past week against New Orleans in a loss. This was his highest passing yardage total since 2019. He also had 2 touchdown passes, and he had 0 interceptions. So he's a locked-in superflex starter. We've now seen Jameis Winston have 2 300-yard passing performances since he took over in Cleveland. Add him if he's available to you in a superflex league. And based on this sort of volume, he's not really a guy we'd want to trust in a single quarterback league, but he's not one we can completely ignore because 300 yards is 300 yards. Will Levis passed for a season-high 295 yards. Now, I get it. There was a 95-yard touchdown to Nick Westbrook-Ikhine. Levis also had 7 rushing attempts. So he's performed better since returning from injury. He's not going to be on the streaming radar for us in single QB leagues, but he's a viable superflex option. Other superflex options for you. Bryce Young, he's going to remain the starter. Awful matchup against Kansas City this week. Gardner Minshew, low-end superflex consideration. Doing one thing very well for us. Gardner Minshew, keep feeding Brock Bowers. Brock Bowers is the truth. And Gardner Minshew knows who to target in that offense. 16 targets to Bowers last week. That was great to see. We're going to keep an eye on Trey Lance. Dallas loses another game. Maybe Trey Lance gets an opportunity. Cooper Rush was a little bit better than he was the week before, but it's still not working. So maybe we see some Trey Lance if you want to take a speculation play. Now, Tommy DeVito. Tommy DeVito is interesting because New York has a very, very fantasy-friendly fantasy schedule for the quarterback position throughout the fantasy playoffs. So the whole Tommy Cutlets, the whole it's a cool story. I think that Thanksgiving Day, where it's Cooper Rush, Tommy DeVito, could be like the worst fantasy matchup we've ever seen at the quarterback position on a Thanksgiving Day game. But I live on Long Island. I will say that there's some people very excited to see like Tommy Cutlets back in the lineup. And it's sort of like the Giants were in a tailspin. Brian Dable's playing for his job. He trusts DeVito to go get a win. And last year, DeVito had 8 touchdowns to only 3 interceptions. That ratio is solid. So we'll see what happens there. I'm sort of pessimistic about the entire situation. I hope that this doesn't affect Malik Neighbors too much or Tyrone Tracy too much, guys that I have in my lineup down the stretch. We'll see. Running back position. My favorite addition this week is Trey Benson, number 1 on the waiver wire. Trey Benson is coming out of his bye week, coming off of back-to-back RB2 finishes in PPR settings. I think Trey Benson is going to get more involved in this Arizona offense after its bye week. Now, last week, my number 1 recommendation, and a lot of people's number 1 recommendations on the waiver wire, was Audric Estime. That fell flat completely. So I'm putting myself out there with another rookie running back this week. But I think when we talk about in terms of upside, fantasy football upside, there is not really a better handcuff for you to roster that's widely available than Benson this week. James Conner playing at an exceptional rate. James Conner is an RB1. James Conner is leading the league in forced missed tackles, playing fantastic. But at the end of the day, Benson has a lot of juice. I think it would make sense for Arizona to mix him in more, and he could become sort of a handcuff plus running back for the rest of the way. Now, if Conner misses any time, it's wheels up for Benson, a big-time athlete who's got a lot of juice and also would be sort of I know that we would concede some touches to Amari DiMercato, but not enough that Benson would get downgraded. So I love adding Trey Benson coming off of his bye week. A little bit of a gamble, but I'm willing to take it. Gus Edwards. Gus Edwards now has 16 carries over his last 2 games. He's the handcuff behind J.K. Dobbins. You also have sort of the revenge game narrative this week where the Harbaugh brothers coach against one another. You've got Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins going up against their old team. Sort of a cool one. Gus Edwards is really not a player you'd want to use. But again, with 6 teams on a bye, there's a lot of players really, really scrambling. Ameer Abdullah. Ameer Abdullah, of course, available to you in 100% of leagues because he's not a player you usually are rostering. But he caught a touchdown on Sunday, and he would be the next man up if Alexander Mattison and Zamir White are unable to play. Both players are banged up. We don't know the full extent of it, but Ameer Abdullah makes my top 10 overall because I think he has not a ton of upside, but I think he's got enough that he could be a RB2 if he gets a spot start. This is a player who can catch the ball, and this is an offense that is willing to target the running backs. So Ameer Abdullah would get elevated into like a really like a lesser version, way lesser version role like Rashad White gets in Tampa Bay in terms of getting a lot of targets out of the backfield. And that would be sort of how he would do it. Maybe he would catch 4 passes, and give you like a low-end RB2 performance. The other running back for speculators, if you're in an FFPC, an NFFC, a deep format, or if you're in a deep dynasty format, Dylan Laube. If White and Madison are out, Dylan Laube will get some touches. 6th round pick. This player was sort of had a buzz in the preseason. This was a player that was getting drafted around guys like Tyrone Tracy, Bucky Irving. There was people who were pushing Dylan Laube up. Not quite as high as those guys in Dynasty, but Dylan Laube was drafted in a lot of rookie drafts. So, like, this is a player who has receiving ability, performed well at the Senior Bowl, and if he gets his opportunity, we'll see what happens. I'm still kind of pessimistic because he hasn't gotten the opportunity yet, but a lot of times we see rookies get their opportunities this time of year, and some of them run with it. So Dylan Laube, if you're in a very deep format, Ameer Abdullah makes my top 10. Jaylen Wright, available to you in 94% of leagues. He's moved ahead of Raheem Mostert. So in the preseason, if we thought that Jaylen Wright would have been the number 2 back in Miami, we would have been like, okay, wheels up. But it's really been the Devaughn Achane show. So Jaylen Wright really is more of a handcuff running back, but at least we know that if Devaughn Achane missed time, Jaylen Wright would most likely be the next man in at this point. Ray Davis, available to you in 77% of leagues. One of the most valuable handcuff running backs for you to roster in football is Ray Davis. If James Cook were to miss time, Davis would become a top 15 start at the position. Davis is a very, very nice player. We're going to talk about Cam Akers. Cam Akers, once again, is available to you in 83% of leagues. He returns to the top 10 overall this week, and he's one of the better handcuffs for you to roster. He's logged 25 touches over his last 2 games, and he caught a touchdown pass on Sunday. He appears to be part of Minnesota's weekly game plan, and I would say now he's like a very low-end flex dart throw during the bye week chaos, and he remains the handcuff to Aaron Jones. So Akers has a number of outs here. He could potentially help you in a bye week, and if Aaron Jones misses time, he'd be an every week RB2. Blake Corum, available to you in 86% of leagues. Corum had 6 touches on Sunday in LA's win over New England. He's one of the most valuable handcuffs in football because of the quality of the offense and the role of the RB1 in a Sean McVay offense. Now, Roschon Johnson returns to the top 10. Johnson saw an increased usage under Thomas Brown. So Thomas Brown takes over as offensive coordinator, and Thomas Brown seems like a big upgrade because he's not making as many bonehead decisions as we saw with Shane Waldron. So Roschon had 10 carries, including a touchdown, and he caught his only target. What was interesting is Roschon had 41% of Chicago's rush attempts. So it made it a little bit more of a split backfield. Now, was this opponent specific? Was it because they were playing Green Bay? I don't know. It seems like this is going to be what Thomas Brown wants to do. So Roschon Johnson, much like Cam Akers, becomes an option for you in these like bye week hell weeks. And it's one to keep an eye on where if it could become a little bit more of a split. And if DeAndre Swift were to go down, we know Roschon Johnson is capable of being a receiving back. Okay, a couple deeper options. Marshawn Lloyd, available in 94% of leagues. He's finally activated off the injured reserve. Justice Hill, available in 80% of leagues, remains the handcuff to Derrick Henry. I had predicted Keaton Mitchell would see a little bit increased usage on my Sleepers podcast. I'll take the L on that one. Justice Hill out-touched him 6-0, and Justice Hill was targeted 7 times. Now, again, we can't expect Justice Hill to get this many targets. Pittsburgh is a difficult opponent. So Baltimore went to attacking them with running back targets. That's not going to be the case every week, but Justice Hill does have contingent value on your bench. If you roster Chase Brown, Khalil Herbert is an option. And if you roster Saquon Barkley, Kenneth Gainwell is an option. Both of those players are sort of the handcuff running back behind running backs that are handling nearly all of the touches. So covered a lot of running backs there. We'll see if any of them break into my top 10. But it's an interesting week. There's a lot of options, but not a lot of plug-and-play players. Wide receiver-wise, Elijah Moore is available in 92% of leagues. Let's keep an eye on his shoulder because he had a slight knock. If he misses practice on Tuesday, then you could sort of downgrade him. But he's going to be a high, like really ranked player in my top 10 this week. He's been a target magnet lately. He has 35 targets over Cleveland's last 4 games. So 35 targets is 35 targets. He's seeing a lot of work in the slot. And as we mentioned, Jameis Winston is slinging it. He's taking shots and he's spreading the ball around to multiple wide receivers. So unlike Cedric Tillman and Jerry Jeudy, Elijah Moore is widely available. He caught 6 passes for 66 yards and a touchdown against New Orleans. This is a player that can be used in the flex if he's ready to go this week. Xavier Legette in Carolina coming out of their bye week. Legette's available to you in 72% of leagues. I think he'll be a wide receiver 4 for the rest of the season. I think Carolina is going to commit to using him nearly every down. Post bye week, you're going to see Legette, their first round pick. They're going to see whatever they can get out of him, and they're going to look to feature him and try to get some momentum heading into 2025. Big, physical, athletic player, slightly touchdown dependent, but he will be on the field a ton. And like we mentioned, rookie wide receivers in the second half of the season, sometimes we see these guys starting to pop. Now, floor play option, Demario Douglas. Demario Douglas available to you in 72% of leagues. Projects as a wide receiver 4 type player, but a different one. This is a floor play. He had 10.9 PPR points on Sunday, caught 5 passes for 59 yards, which is about what you can expect from him moving forward. He's likely to be in many lineups in week 12 and week 14, though, because 10.9 points, getting that sort of 5 for 60 stat line, that is going to help you in a lot of deeper leagues during week 12 and week 14. He's sort of the most reliable wide receiver in New England. And again, I like Drake Maye. Marquez Valdes-Scantling. So MVS, I mentioned him in this Sleepers article heading into his big week 9 game. Then again, his big week 10 game. Then last week, he did it again. So like MVS, it's kind of funny to recommend MVS, but we're going to be real here. And he's going to get shots downfield, it looks like, in this offense every single week. He's sort of in it's a different role, but some of those Rashid Shaheed targets downfield that we saw early in the year are going to MVS. He has 196 yards and 3 touchdowns over his last 2 games. He's had touchdowns in consecutive weeks. And again, a huge amount of air yards. So I think this week you can add him. New Orleans, of course, is on a bye week, so it's not going to cost you as much. And see if this role maintains over the rest of the season. It looks like this is the kind of guy that's going to get 4 or 5 targets every single week, and they're downfield ones. So again, he might be somebody that can help you in week 14. We'll see. Alec Pierce had a solid game this past week with Anthony Richardson under center. Of course, Alec Pierce made a big catch down the stretch that was on that final drive where Richardson ended up running into the end zone for a touchdown. Really, really strong moment for Richardson. So Pierce made a big play. So that's the kind of thing when these quarterbacks are targeting you in big situations, it means they like you. And Anthony Richardson has taken shots to Alec Pierce all season long. So Pierce is another guy where the volume is difficult to trust, but he will get downfield targets. Really a boom bust type play. But again, in bye week hell, he's viable. Michael Wilson, deep league option only, available to you in 89% of leagues. Nick Westbrook-Ikhine now has a touchdown in 5 out of his last 6 games. So Calvin Ridley's really the wide receiver you want to play in this offense. But if you're in a extremely deep format and you're chasing touchdowns, 5 out of 6 weeks, he's found the end zone. So he's a difficult player to trust, but this is like a heater. This is a touchdown streak, and he scored a 98-yard touchdown this past week. So he's back. Like, we got to talk about him every week now until he kind of cools off. Ray McCloud, this is a fun one. If your team is in good shape, then Ray McCloud is a player you want to add. If you don't need a player this week, McCloud is going to be on bye. He's available to you in 83% of leagues. But if Darnell Mooney misses time, Ray McCloud would be a starter in a lot of deeper formats, like a start 3 wide receiver in a flex format PPR league. Ray McCloud would be a starter if Mooney misses time. Mooney's been really good this year. He's been a wide receiver 1 for most of the season. Ray McCloud, though, I think would be a 20% plus target share guy in any game that Mooney misses. I don't think he's got the same upside as Mooney, but he did catch 6 passes for 46 yards this past week. I like adding Ray McCloud. I'm going to add some myself. Devaughn Vele caught 4 passes for 66 yards. Bo Nix is playing really, really well. Vele is available in 98% of leagues. He's got some value to you in deep leagues. Again, rookie wide receiver. He's an older one, but he's still a rookie. And Denver, outside of Cortland Sutton, needs consistent targets in the offense. Now, another deep league player to add that is going to be way less consistent than Devaughn Vele, but Marvin Mims is available to you in 99% of leagues. He's a role player. He doesn't see enough snaps to be fantasy relevant. So his snap share is low, but he did score a touchdown this past week, and they've been using him on manufactured running attempts. So Mims is an interesting player to add. It's fun to talk about Marvin Mims. I was high on Marvin Mims coming out of college. I thought that he would be a fantasy relevant player. It hasn't worked with Sean Payton, but we are starting to see him get a lot of touches on a per snap basis. Maybe that results in an increasing role. Jalen Coker, available to you in 95% of leagues. Coker was targeted 8 times in Carolina's last game heading into the bye week, so he's worth monitoring. I much prefer Xavier Legette, just because I think the profiles of the players, I think that they're going to try to get Legette more involved, but Coker is a player. Like, getting 8 targets, that can't be ignored. One other thing to worry about with Coker is Adam Thielen is going to be back. Now, this is a wild card. Adam Thielen, if you're a speculator and you're looking for kind of bad team fantasy production, Adam Thielen is a player who was very solid last year, now returns from a bye week, from an injury, and now he's going to be attached to Bryce Young, who was a quarterback for a lot of his high-end fantasy performances last year. Bryce Young had like tunnel vision for Thielen. Thielen was a wide receiver 1 for a lot of last season, finished as a wide receiver 2. So Thielen could be a sneaky add this week, and he's available to you in 80% of leagues. Kayshon Boutte is available in 96% of leagues. He caught 4 passes this past week, and he's had 4 straight games with 6 targets. So, like, we haven't seen him even outscore Demario Douglas, but Boutte's on the field like the entire game. So this is a player that, because he's on the field a ton, is going to be viable. Adonai Mitchell. Adonai Mitchell is available to you in 93% of leagues. I was a little too high on Adonai, but again, we weren't expecting the Anthony Richardson switch when we ranked him highly. But Adonai Mitchell's a player that, if you're in a deep league, let's keep an eye on him. I don't think we necessarily cut him, but it looks like Alec Pierce is going to be ahead of him in the pecking order with Richardson. John Mechie makes the list. Again, trailed off. This is going to be a Nico Collins, Tank Dell situation more so than anything. And that wraps up for the wide receivers. So some interesting names, some contingent upside guys, and some sneaky sources of targets. Now, tight end, there's a huge standout. Will Dissly. Will Dissly is sort of Zach Ertz, but maybe in a better situation because he's getting the consistent target share. So Will Dissly, I think, is going to be a borderline tight end 1 kind of moving forward. This is a player that's found an ideal fit in LA. We got to get the notion of Will Dissly in Seattle sort of out of our heads because LA's using him in a much more expanded role. So reality is what it is. And we're talking about week 12, and Will Dissly is going to be in a lot of lineups this week. He had 4 catches for 80 yards and a touchdown last week. And he also led the team in targets in week 10. So Dissly is an interesting player. And he's had 6 or more targets now in 4 out of his last 5 games played. So he's a top 10 overall addition this week. And if you need a tight end and your team's in bad tight end shape, this is a player you really want to go for and make sure you add, because Disley has a role in an offense that's expanding. And as an added bonus, Baltimore has been very generous to opposing tight ends this year. They've been a team that's given up a lot of fantasy scoring at the position. So Disley has the role. Disley has the strong performance he's coming off of, and he's got a very strong matchup in week 12. Will Disley's a strong ad. So there we go. We're talking about Will Disley in week 12. Who would have thought it? Isaiah Likely back on the radar. Isaiah Likely was cut in a bunch of leagues, but he caught 4 passes for 75 yards in Baltimore's loss to Pittsburgh. So he's back on the radar. Likely, again, is a difficult player to trust because we know they're going to play multiple tight ends, but we know that Isaiah Likely came on strongly to end last season. Maybe history repeats itself. It sure seems like he needs a Mark Andrews injury to really take off. But again, it's a very quality offense. So I'd rather have like Isaiah Likely on my bench than a number of guys who really are in like poor offenses. Because if I'm chasing a single game, I'd rather chase it with a good offense. Theo Johnson, available to you in 99% of leagues. Not only does he have the best first name in fantasy football, but he's been targeted 6 times in consecutive games. Very athletic rookie. And with Tommy DeVito under center, we don't know where the target distribution is going to go. And I know a lot of people want to look at what he did last year, but last year was a completely different Giants team. Saquon Barkley was there. They didn't have Malik Neighbors. They didn't have Tyrone Tracy. They didn't have Theo Johnson. Wan'Dale Robinson availability was sporadic. So this is and was banged up for a lot of the year. So this is a different Giants team than DeVito was at last year. So maybe the tight end position becomes a position that he targets. Theo Johnson worth a speculative ad, especially in deep leagues. Another rookie to consider adding, Jatavian Sanders. He's a tight end too for the rest of the season. He caught a touchdown in week 10, and he had 87 receiving yards in week 9. Carolina was on a bye last week. Let's keep an eye on Dawson Knox as well. Dalton Kincaid should be back after Buffalo's bye week, but you never know if there's going to be regression from an injury. Injuries can flame up once again, and we do know that Dawson Knox played pretty well this past week. He's had 40 or more yards in 3 out of his last 4 games. So if Kincaid misses another week, Knox would be a guy that's used in a lot of leagues. He'd be like a high-end tight end too in that situation. All right, so we got it. We got through it. Again, make sure that you're not missing guys on a bye. That's number 1. Go through your lineup, see what you need to cover before you put in your waiver wire bids. Then take a glimpse to week 14. Make sure you have some players that can go in for those guys that you're going to miss in week 14. It's difficult to be 2 weeks away, but if you're in a deeper format, you can sometimes do that, especially when it comes to like the one-off positions, your kickers, your defenses. Get that out of the way. Make sure you have a backup quarterback that is not having the same bye week. Like, for example, if you have Lamar Jackson and your backup is Bo Nix, they both have a bye week in week 14. So keep an eye on that sort of thing. But my overall top 10 ads this week, number 1, Trey Benson. Number 2, Elijah Moore. Number 3, Will Disley. Number 4, Drake Maye. Now, again, Trey Benson, Elijah Moore, Will Disley, Drake Maye, my top 4. You can change the order based on your team needs. So if tight end is a priority for you, absolutely move Will Disley up. If you're struggling at wide receiver, move Elijah Moore up. Breaking ties, I love having Trey Benson at number 1. But again, if you need a quarterback, it's Drake Maye. Tight end, it's Will Disley. Wide receiver, it's Elijah Moore. And everything being equal, or running back, Trey Benson. So once again, my top 10 overall, Trey Benson at 1, Elijah Moore at 2, Will Disley at 3, Drake Maye at 4, Cam Akers at 5, Ameer Abdullah at 6, Marquez Valdes-Scantling at 7, Blake Corum at 8, Roschon Johnson at 9, Xavier Legette at 10. And a brief note, you can flip-flop Ameer Abdullah and Cam Akers as well if you need a spot start this week. Akers, rest of the season, clearly a much better ad. But again, Abdullah might have a start this week, and Akers would be in a if anything, a backup situation behind Aaron Jones. So again, my top 10 overall, Trey Benson, Elijah Moore, Will Disley, Drake Maye, Cam Akers, Ameer Abdullah, Marquez Valdes-Scantling, Blake Corum, Roschon Johnson, Xavier Legette. Again, I'm Theo Gremminger. This is Waiver Wired. We're going to be back here next week in week 13. We're going to help you get going all the way to the finish line. We're going to help you crush your leagues this season. Stick with us here at Player Profiler. We got you covered all week long. Some amazing programming, some great podcasts, and check out all of my written work over at playerprofiler.com.
Hey, I want to thank you for being part of this broadcast. If you have any thoughts on it, leave a comment. If you enjoyed it, make sure you leave a like. And if you want to see more shows on the Player Profiler channel, subscribe to it. That's how we know you want more.